I'd like to ask you the same question I ask the children. Has there been anybody in your life whose spiritual presence had such an impact upon you that it was immediate and long-lasting? That you can still feel that person's presence in your life even though they may have died or if they may not just be here at the moment? I'm glad to see a few shaking heads. Some of you are like, what's he talking about? But it's good to see some of those shaking heads, because I think one of the things that's very important in life is that we have that sense of connection with others. Not just, people that we admire and revere, such as Jesus, but also people in general. If it were not for people around us, we would not learn how to be human ourselves. When I think of those people who've had some of the biggest impacts, I mentioned Harold Beck, a professor of mine in seminary. I also mentioned my grandfather, who has always been a strong spiritual presence in my life. There's been a couple other people as well. Jesus, of course, I think you would expect that in my life. Though I never have seen him physically, that spiritual presence of Jesus has always been a part of my life, having grown up in the church and being taught from Sunday school to watching my grandfather in the pulpit every Sunday morning. There's somebody else that I want to make just mention, because it was a person whom a lot of people around the world know and who they revere, and that is the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was or still is, he may be renouncing his well, he actually renounced some of his political positions just recently, I think, because he is getting up in age. But I met the Dalai Lama when he came into my classroom. One of his students, Geisha Sopa, who is at UW-Madison, was teaching a course in Buddhism. He's the one who did Deer Park in Madison, if you're familiar with Deer Park. And he invited the Dalai Lama, of all people, while we were having this class, to come and visit. And I must say, I had read some of his works and such, and some of his readings, and if there's anybody that living today that would probably approximate Jesus, or as I imagine Jesus to be, it'd probably be him. And there's just, when he walked in the room, there was a palpable, ooh, there's just a presence about him. Now, the Dalai Lama is called the Bodhisattva of compassion. And the Bodhisattva is basically just a kind of a spiritual being, so to speak, but compassion being the prime virtue. And that is exactly what I felt from him. This sense of loving kindness and compassion that just extended. I mean, he had this presence in which I thought if I asked even the stupidest question of him, he would be compassionate towards me. And it was just incredible. Now, a person may say, well, whether it's your grandfather or Harold Beck or Jesus or the Dalai Lama, could it not have been just your projection of trying to make them bigger than they really were? For a skeptic, I probably could not argue the case against that. But in my heart, I say, that doesn't mix with my experience. My experience of all of those people was something more than just what a skeptic could easily deny. I'm not exactly sure how, I don't have the words to explain that spiritual presence that I felt in all these people, but I know it's true. It's true in a way that is not empirical. So if you say, can you prove it? I'll have to say, no, I can't. There's no way that I can empirically prove it. It's not a science. And it is not meant to be, because what it is an experience of the sacred, of the divine. And that's something that goes beyond proofs. It is about experience. And I wonder that in this passage that was just read, whether Jesus is trying to instill in his disciples his spiritual presence among them before he leaves physically from them. said, if you go and you love one another, you love me, then I and the Father will make a home in you. Will make a home in you. Now, when he says such language, making a home within us, we pretty much know that he's not being literal. We know that he's using a language that goes beyond language itself. We know that he's talking about some reality that is not verifiable, it's not falsifiable, it's not provable. It's something in which we experience. And I think that is the presence of Jesus still today in the church. That spiritual presence, that ineffable way of living and being in the world, that it has been passed down from generation to generation, now for over 2,000 years. That is something special. The good thing about it is that we can keep passing it on. That if that spiritual presence of Jesus, or Harold Beck, or Robert P. Hawkins, or the Dalai Lama, or whoever in our own lives has had an influence, that presence can be passed on, whether or not they are with us in the flesh or not. I had a person in one of my churches that I served, and I knew this person to be a skeptic, and somebody who, had some issues with organized religion and such. He came basically because his wife wanted him to come. And he came into my office one day, and I had given him some sermons and such, and he wasn't exactly figuring me out so much because I didn't speak, he told me, like a lot of other pastors did, and he wanted to know exactly where I was at. And so he just came up to me in my office one day, very straight-faced, and asked me flat out if it could be proved that Jesus never rose, that he died and that was the end of the story, how would that affect your faith? I want you to think about that, your own answer to that question for a second. How would it affect your faith? I've been in ministry for a long time. I've thought about these sort of questions for decades. So I had an immediate response to him that came from my heart and my soul. One of the things I knew that I would not be able to convince him is to give any kind of proof. It wasn't going to happen. If a person's skeptical, they're not going to be swayed by anything that I could say. So instead, I tried to do what I thought Jesus would do. What Harold Beck might do. What my grandfather might do. And what I think maybe the Dalai Lama would do. And that is, kind of skirt the question, and instead of saying, what is the real importance here? I think Jesus would have said, it's not about me. It's about what I've taught. It's not about who I am. It's about the virtues and the values that I uphold. I believe in my heart of hearts, have for a long, long time, that simply believing in Jesus is not what Jesus really wanted us to do. That may sound a little strange, but I believe it in all my heart, because time and time again, you can go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and even John, which is the most strange of all the Gospels. But even in John, in this passage here, it's interesting. I want you to just listen again. Judas, Jesus had just said to them that the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. And to that question, Judas said to him, Lord, how is it that you will reveal yourself to us and not to the world? Here's that spiritual stuff going on. It's the spiritual presence, not a physical presence that we're talking about. He knew that he wasn't going to be around physically anymore. He knew that his time was coming. He was going to get crucified. And whatever we believe about what happened after that, he knew that at some point, physically speaking, he wasn't going to be around. It said earlier that I will not leave you orphaned. Well, 2,000 years later, when a lot of people have been thinking about second coming of Jesus, when's he going to show up physically into the world? And people have that on their mind. I say, oh, you missed the point. Jesus wasn't talking about physically being present. He was speaking about spiritually being present with you. The important thing is that you love one another. Through each of the Gospels, this is what Jesus says is most important. The church has made it most important that you believe the right things. And this is where I think the church has gone wrong. And the church only had that, and by the way, just a little bit of history. Back in the day, after Jesus, there were a lot of theories about who Jesus was and what he was about. 300 years later, Constantine and the church made church doctrine unified, being one position out of the hundreds of positions there were about who Jesus was. Personally, I think Constantine got it wrong. Because if I look at what the Scriptures say, Jesus, time and again, deflects any attention towards himself and says, love one another. Even in this passage in John, the answer to Judas's question, how will the world not see you, but we see you? Notice the answer. It sounds like it's not the answer at all, but I think that it is. He says, those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them, love, and we will come to them and make our home with them. It is about letting love live in us, in which God and Christ make a home in us. That spiritual presence is what Jesus, I believe, was talking about. I could be wrong. I don't think I am, but I could be. That's part of the dialogue that the church needs to continue to have throughout its history, and it's what has kept the church alive. The church has only survived because it has been able to look at its doctrines, and within each culture, within each era, has been able to make sense of those in new ways. We live in an age which is unlike any of the ages that has ever been before us. I grew up barely with TV. Computers were not even a thought when I was a kid. They first came around, I think, when I was in high school. This is kind of dating me, isn't it? But now, people can't do without their computers. And in fact, well, actually they can, because they got these things called cell phones now, which was, it's like Scotty and Captain Kirk. It's a whole new world. And this is a world in which is much more skeptical and much more learned than the world has ever been. Even in third world countries, there is education in which there never has been before. And people are, since the Enlightenment, have been much more empirically centered in their lives. Well, if you're going to say this is true, you've got to prove it to me. We're like the Thomas. We're a generation of Thomases. We've got to see it for ourselves, or else we're not going to believe. And I think that's where we've gone wrong. I think that's why Jesus said to Thomas in another passage, blessed are those who have not seen, yet still believe. Now, we may interpret that as being all about Jesus. I think Jesus would say, you got it wrong again. It's about what I taught and what I value, not about me. Please don't make it about me. It is about loving one another And that's the thing you've got to have faith in. And to our world today, I've heard people say this. I heard it about, I've heard it just recently, but in the most explicit form I heard it, I said to about 4 or 5 months ago, to a young lady that what she had done was nice. And she said, "Don't say I'm nice." And I said, "Really? Why should I not say that you're nice?" Because nice people get stomped on. They get taken advantage of. And you know, as a person who wants to be a nice person, I know that that's true. I know it from my heart. It's true. I even got marks to show on it. Being nice does not, in this world, always get you what you want. The interesting thing is, Jesus really wasn't concerned about what this world could give you. See where I'm going? If you really want to believe in what Jesus believed himself, and what Jesus believed in, it was love. And that we could be as loving even as he. That's another thing that we have a lot of trouble with. We talked about this a little bit last Sunday. But it is so true. That's the thing to have faith in. But it is one of the hardest things in the world to have faith in because, well, we see what happens to people when they love. They get broken hearts, don't they? We get broken hearts, we get disillusioned. Things don't go the way that we do, and then we say, well, where's God? My mother died. My father died. Actually, they have, but I'm using this as illustration of events in lives that cause us crisis of faith. If faith is simply about getting our way and having things the way we want them, we've gone astray. What faith is really about is having faith in that which is most important. And what is that again? Love. I can't tell you how many times that by having faith and love that I've got stomped on. That it hasn't worked for me. But I would not give it up for anything in the world. And that's because I have faith in it. That even if it doesn't work this time, the thing that I know is true is that believing in it, believing in what Christ's example was, and whom God represents, and my own idea of who God is loving and compassionate and kind and patient and generous, forgiving. All these virtues, that's who God is. That's who Jesus represented. If I have those in myself, even though I may not get my way all the time or even most of the time, the thing that I receive from that is a spiritual presence within that says it's all right anyway. Because this love is what gives life meaning. It's what gives life purpose. And if we let it dwell in us, we are letting God dwell in us. I have to say that sometimes faith is really tough. You know that I've been here before at your church some time back. For 2 years, I've been actually searching for a church. I love to preach. I love to be a pastor. I have not been able to find in those 2 years a church that said, yeah, we want you on. I've come so close about 3 or 4 times. Second pick. But you've got to recognize how disillusioning it can be after 2 years of searching, and you think, oh my gosh, what's going on? At times, my friends, some of my closest friends, one in particular I can think about says, you know, it's just too hard. Why don't you go into another profession? Well, temporarily I have, simply to try to make ends meet. But he was talking about, why don't you just do a different profession? Because we've been excellent friends. He knows I've had hard knocks in ministry and stuff, even when I'm in a pastoral position. He says, is it worth it? Why don't you just do something else that, you're good at so many different things. Why not just go into a different profession? I said, because it's in here. I could do something else, but it wouldn't escape the fact that it's in me. I am a pastor. I am one who wants to preach the gospel of love, and who has seen that gospel transform people from despair and near suicide to saying, my God, that's the answer I've been looking for. I am so grateful for that presence that goes beyond me in those times. And I say it goes beyond me because it does. I borrow it from Harold Beck. I borrow it from my grandfather. I borrow it from the Dalai Lama. I borrow it from Jesus. I borrow it from all those who have had a positive impact on my life because of their presence in my life. And I want to pass that on. And I think there's no better profession for me than ministry because of that. We all have our own ministries. Whatever we do in life. I found that out having to do some other jobs other than ministry. I'm still a minister even though I'm in a different career. It's who I am. Grace, though, is that sense of letting love live in us, of letting that divine and spiritual presence of God abide in our hearts, in our minds and souls, that we let love be a home in us. And when we let that be a home in us, then we become like the people I've been talking about, those with a spiritual presence. And others see it in us. I can't say that, and this doesn't often happen, but I can't say that I've ever felt more complimented when somebody came up to me and said, I can just feel the love, the kindness, whatever words that they use. And I'm blown away. It's what I want to exude, but which I know in my own heart I rarely do. And that's where we're all at, I think. But we need to have faith that it's possible for it to happen more often. If we don't have faith that we can love as Jesus loved, it's not going to happen very often. There's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a recent article today I want to just make mention of. It's in Time magazine, the most recent article. It's on optimism. It's called The Optimism Bias. And it talks a little bit about how we're wired, hardwired, so to speak, towards optimism. Now, I know a few people that contradict that. But nonetheless, it says that, those who live longest, those who are most healthy, they tend to be towards the optimistic. Now, they say that, those who are optimistic, they really don't have a good grasp on reality. They're not able to predict the future. If you ask an optimist, what's the next 5 years, 10 years going to bring, next day going to bring, they're going to make it rosier than what somebody else might make it. In this, it actually said, and I'm going to quote, while healthy people expect the future to be slightly better than it ends up being, people with severe depression tend to be pessimistically biased. They expect things to be worse than they end up. And here's the part I find most interesting. People with mild depression are relatively accurate when predicting future events. In other words, in the absence of the neural mechanism that generates unrealistic optimism, it is possible all humans would be mildly depressed. So basically, in a way, you can interpret this as saying, if you see reality as it is, it's kind of depressing. No better argument have I for faith than that. Faith keeps us optimistic. It keeps us believing that life for us and for others and the world can be better than it is. Better than the way that we see it. And isn't that what Jesus tried to do? Help us to see that the world could be better than it was in his day. Isn't it what the Dalai Lama has tried to do? And people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, Reverend R.P. Hawkins, and my old professor, Harold Beck. Can you fill in the blanks in your life? That is what faith really is about. It is about believing in something that is not yet, but something that is wonderful and ideal. I've been called an idealist before as though it was a criticism. And I've had to say, thank you. Because I would rather be a delusional, and I've been called that before too. I'd rather be a delusional idealist than a completely accurate pessimist. Because life is so much more full. And I can do so much more good in the world. If I go around and accurately portray the world as it is, it might be a little pessimistic if that's the only thing that I'm able to give back to the world, is just what I see. Because Jesus said, not to give back what's been given to you, but to give back something so much more worthwhile. When you have not been loved, I tell you, love one another. Give back love to the world, no matter what. Have faith in love that was in Christ, and that represents God and all those people we most revere. And you will know a peace that goes beyond comprehension. God's blessings.